just having our maize and beet meeting this morning, and we look at some of the other crop options that are available to people as well. A huge welcome to everybody. There's a lot of people who had signed up to be part of the webinar this morning. And I suppose there's a couple of reasons. I suppose, first of all, it's not possible to do anything out in the fields these days, so there's not an awful lot else, I suppose, pulling people away. I think it's been the longest period, well, it's the longest period of wet weather that I can ever remember. And so I'm around for quite a while in the agricultural industry. To me, it started raining in July, and like from then there was nearly a day a week where there was more than an inch of rain right through July and into August, and then we probably had a few dry days in September, and then since then, sure, it's been really, really wet. And while the days were long and the temperatures were higher in July and August, I mean, field conditions remained okay, but once we get into October, then it really deteriorated. And so it's created huge problems generally in the industry. It's problems for everybody, from the arable farming side of things, all the livestock side of things as well at this stage. And okay, I suppose what we're looking at this morning is just some of the fodder crop options that are there, and ones that are tried and tested and proven, and ones that are being used by a huge number of people already. And I suppose we want to do a kind of an update or a refresher on some of the stuff in that situation, and then also where people might look at doing a crop of maize or a crop of beet or a whole crop cereal, maybe that they haven't done for a while. It's just what we're going to do this morning really is just an update, and we're not going to cover it and everything in absolute detail. And I suppose what I would say is, you know, if anyone wants any extra information or more detailed information, you can contact myself. I'm joined this morning by Joe Millerick, who's my colleague in Goldcrop and who covers a lot of the southeastern part of the country from our point of view. And I'm joined by my old friend Ciaran Collins, who's a tillage advisor with Teagasc and lots of experience in the industry. So he'll cover some of the areas on the agronomy. Again, just in terms of the whole fodder situation, and like the way we see it, is that the east and the south of the country is certainly they're the areas that really have a problem. And that's because, look, it's not normal to house livestock in October in those parts of the country. And it's not normal to have most livestock or a lot of livestock still indoors, still consuming silage or maize silage or something like that. More used to a 4-month winter rather than a 6-month winter. So obviously fodder stocks have been exhausted. And, you know, this is, I suppose, an intensive livestock part of the country where there's highly profitable farming, and look, steps are going to have to be taken to make sure there's enough fodder for next winter. So with that, I have a number of slides just to, I suppose, to visualize the messages we're giving across. And so I'll start sharing those there now. Okay. So yeah, so I hope everyone can see that. So so I have some slides just to go through and highlight some of the points, but I suppose we want to kind of try and cover as much as possible in normal language, and you know, be available for any questions that people have. And there is a Q&A function that you can put your questions into in there, and we will deal with all those questions as we go through the information this morning. So I suppose just to lead in, what we look at is, I'll cover, first of all, just kind of looking at in general at the different options that are there. Then Joe Millerick will look in a bit more detail at the maize varieties that are available from Goldcrop. Then I look at beet varieties and Conviso beet, just an update on where that's at. A brief look at cereal silages and what's available, and then we'll turn over to Ciaran Collins, who'll give an agronomy update looking at herbicides and crop nutrition, and then he'll cover just the availability of the grower and purchase contracts that Teagasc have on their site, just to facilitate trade between farmers. So with that, I lead into it now. I suppose the first thing that I would say is that in Goldcrop we have a forage crop catalogue, so it's grass, clover and forage crop catalogue. So almost all the information that I have on the slides is in that, and that's available to download from goldcrop.ie, or if anybody wants a paper copy, we gladly post it to anyone that hasn't got one. Just send us an email and we'd be able to send you on a paper copy. But as I say, it is available to download from our website. And most of the information is in that, or almost all of the information. And so particularly in the area that I'll cover at the start, like, okay, the next slide, you'll say, you know, how could you possibly put so many numbers on a slide and expect people to interact with it? And the answer is I probably don't, because all this information is in the catalogue. And what I would just want to do is I just want to highlight the crop options maybe that are there, and the ones that, you know, how they compare with one another. And we'll cover some of the main ones then. So to me, it's along the top green line there, maize in the open. That's one option. Maize with plastic, and at this stage, it's all compostable film. Fodder beet, and when I look at fodder beet in this scenario where you're looking at, you know, what do you put into an animal, you got to include the cost of washing and chopping it as well. First cut silage, second cut silage, and okay, we've red clover silage in a 3-cut situation with red clover silage, and that stacks up pretty well. Whole crop winter wheat and whole crop spring wheat. So they're the options that we're going to just compare to one another in the first few slides. And I have full costings in, I'd say it's in page 2 or 3 of our catalogue. So each item is listed in terms of the cost of it, all the machinery operations and the inputs. And the total figure then, excluding VAT, comes to the top line here. So for maize in the open, it's just over 700. Move across for something like beet, it's 975, washed and chopped. And then if we want to see, you know, what's the cost of food you produce from that, we have to make assumptions. So I'm making assumptions then in terms of yield across all those crops. So what I'm assuming is a moderate yield, something that's achievable on average over a 5 or a 10-year period, with good management and the ups and downs of the weather as it may come along. And so in all cases, it's moderate yields. And for sure, if we look at the fodder beet yield I have here of 31.6 tonne, look, plenty of people had 40 tonne of Enermax last year, but it's not fair, I suppose, to take the bumper yield of every crop and start looking at that as the way of costing the cost of these foodstuffs. So when the comparisons are made, they're all moderate yields. So they're all sort of produced in the same type year in the same type management situation. I'm making assumptions about the dry matter percentage of all these crops, and then obviously in the dry matter yield that you're getting per acre. And all these figures are per acre. I'm from the old school. And then with feeds like maize, with any type of silage feed, when you put it into the pit, there are losses. You don't get to feed out everything that you put in. And a standard industry figure would be about 10% in siling losses and waste losses at feed out for maize silages, for grass silages. For beet, it's about probably 5%. But all the silages, I'm assuming, a 10% less. So that what you actually put into an animal at the end of the day is the dry matter utilized figure. And then in terms of costing that, we could just say, look, what's the cost per tonne of dry matter? And that's divide the tonnes into the cost, and you get a figure here. So it's 142 for maize in the open. What I prefer to look at in terms of feed cost or feed value is 1,000 UFL cost. And 1,000 UFL is the energy content of 1 tonne of dried barley. So barley at 86% dry matter. And that's an industry standard figure. So in other words, 1,000 UFLs is the energy content of 1 tonne of barley. And to achieve that amount of energy with maize in the open, it's costing €173. To achieve it with maize with plastic, it's 196, and so on. And I'll show you all these in a graph in a sec to try and visualize how they compare. And to be a bit fairer to bought-in feedstuffs, it's probably more accurate to look at them with a land cost. And okay, this is something that varies as you go around the countryside. So I put in a land cost of €250 an acre, and some will say, look, that's too low. A few years ago, it was too high, but now obviously there's huge competition from land, and driven by some of the EU policies that are there, or the EU restrictions that are coming on farming. And the reality is that it isn't possible to get that acre of land for 250 in some parts of the country, but there are lots of longer term deals that may be at that. But I'm using that figure just to try, and it's fair across all the systems. And then so the cost per ton of dry matter utilised for that maize in the open goes up to 192 because it's about 5 tonnes divided into 550, so it's an extra €50 per tonne. And then if I look at the cost per 1,000 UFLs, it's 234. Now, what I would say on that is if you take the same land cost across all crops, then the crops that have the highest yield dilute that a bit more per tonne. So that's the most complicated slide that I'm going to show you for the day. And I will say all that information is available in the catalogue to download. And now I just want to have a quick visual comparison of some of those different options. So first of all, I'm looking at the crops that are going to be in the ground for a full year. So I'm not looking at grass silage in this comparison or something like red clover silage, because there would be other grazing done on those fields. But if I just look at maize in the open, maize with compostable plastic, fodder beet washed and chopped, whole crop winter wheat, and whole crop spring wheat. And they are, like we showed you, like we looked at a while ago, that's the cost per acre to grow those crops. And then if we look at, on the same slide, I just put in what sort of yield assumptions I had made in terms of what you can produce from those crops. And you can see that the crops with the higher cost, they are the ones with the higher yield potential. So in the end, the difference between the cost per ton of dry matter or the cost per unit of energy between all these options, there isn't that much in the difference. And this is kind of visualizing exactly why, because the more expensive ones are the ones that have those higher yields. So I have 2 slides now just to look at how they all do compare. And this is essentially for, I mean, if you're looking at your options and saying, what should I do? I need more fodder. What are my possibilities? And we'll cover in a minute some of the agronomy things you have to do with these crops to get them to perform. And there are requirements that you'd have to grow maize or to grow beet. But all things being equal, with good management on decent sites, and with all the assumptions that I've made, this is how I expect the crops all compare. So this is cost per ton of dry matter, and the blue bar is with no land cost. But it's probably fairer to look at it in the red bar, so with a land cost. And if you take it purely on cost per ton of dry matter, yeah, so, and I have red clover silage in there, and red clover silage, I suppose, it benefits from the fact that there's little or maybe no nitrogen input into that crop. A high P and K requirement, but no nitrogen. So that helps it from a cost point of view. What I would say is, in terms of all these crop options, I have assumed index 3 for P and index 3 for K. So in other words, fields that are already quite good. And in all situations, look, if it's index 2 or index 1, more P and K has to go out across all the crop options. So in terms of the cost per ton of dry matter, red clover silage is 173. And then the mainstream ones, first cut silage is 187. Whole crop winter wheat, 190. And maize in the open, 192. So you could say, look, they're all essentially the same. They're really, really similar in terms of the cost. It's almost the same. Slightly dearer, second cut silage. Slightly dearer also maize with plastic. And that situation has changed in the last few years, because now the plastic, this biodegradable compostable plastic, what we've seen of it, it works really well, but it's substantially more expensive. It's twice the price nearly of the plastic that was available 3, 4, 5 years ago. Whole crop spring wheat, more expensive than whole crop winter wheat, because it's not got enough yield to dilute its cost. And on this way of looking at it, fodder beet works out relatively expensive if you look at it on a dry matter ton cost. Okay, so like I said, I like looking at feedstuffs from the point of view of their, just one sec. Oh yeah, the cost per 1,000 UFL, because it's a more accurate comparison to a bought-in alternative. So in all cases, you know, if you're going to be short of fodder, what are your options? And your options are, okay, I grow something else, I buy a fodder crop from somebody else, or I buy concentrate feedstuffs. So this is the figure you would use to compare to a concentrate feedstuff. So again, the relative positions haven't changed that much, except fodder beet, because of its very high energy content, has gained substantially, because it's essentially, it feels like a concentrate. It's a much higher energy content per kilo of dry matter. So fodder beet washed and chopped becomes, you know, thereabouts the best value of all the fodder crop options. along with the red clover silage. And certainly when you put in a land cost, fodder beet is the best option. And that situation hasn't changed. That's the way it's always been. It's always been the best one when you look at it from an energy content point of view. And again, first cut silage and whole crop wheat and maize in the open are all really, really similar. So they are three options that cost-wise, assuming you can grow a good crop of either, they work out pretty similar. And then, if you were looking at choosing between those three, the things that come into consideration are, do you have suitable land to grow a crop of maize? Is it at a suitable height over sea level? Is it warm enough and south facing enough? And okay, we've plenty of time to sow a maize crop now, but in a whole crop winter wheat situation, obviously that crop would have to be sown last autumn. And so what you're looking at there maybe is buying a crop from somebody who has a crop on the ground. So that may not be a possibility. Also, something like whole crop wheat and maize, they fit very well for an outside block of land. So that's why they might have an advantage in some situations over first cut silage. And going on over second cut silage is a little more expensive. The maize with plastics a little more expensive. Whole crop spring wheat a little more expensive. And as I said, the fodder beet works out very well on this comparison. So it's going to be, and again, like I said at the start, look, bar the red clover silage, which is a relatively new crop on Irish farms, and it's one that, look, there's loads of trial work to tell us that told us for the last 20 years that it was a super option and had possibilities to work really, really well. But when fertilizer nitrogen was cheap, it just wasn't considered very strongly. And so we've seen a big increase in the areas being sown to red clover silage in the last 3 years. And we expect that to continue because it's working well, and the feed results that come from some of the trial work that's going on at the moment, again, replicating the results that were achieved 20 years ago by Padraig O'Reilly and Grange, they are very good. So it works out well, and again, probably fits for an outside block that's going to be the silage block of land. But if we look at the mainstream ones, first cut silage, whole crop wheat, maize in the open, yeah, look, they're, and right across, all these options are all tried and tested, and they're the ones that spring to mind, or they're the ones that people will go to because we know they work. And so that's a very important part of the whole story. So just a quick, I suppose, couple of slides then on beet and maize and just how they compare with one another. And then, look, soon after that, we'll be looking at the varieties. But beet, it needs to be considered like a concentrate. It is low in protein, so it's kind of 6 to 8% crude protein. And again, based on trial work, if you want to visualize what the beet will do, on a dry matter basis, it gives an equivalent animal performance to roll barley. So in other words, if you have a ton of roll barley, which is probably 86% dry matter, so that's 860 kilos of dry material. Well, if you can come up with 860 kilos, which is probably 4 tons of sugar beet, that will give you the same animal performance. And one of the benefits of something like beet is it's extremely efficient from the point of view of its time in the rumen. In fact, it can cause problems in diets because being too quickly digested, but assuming an animal is settled on it, it's really quick in the rumen, and therefore it has potential to increase an animal's intake on a day. The issues, I suppose, the negatives with it, number one, there is feed preparation required, and it needs to be done, some of it has to be done on the day of feeding. So ideally, beet would be offered to animals washed, and then it has to be chopped. So that's obviously a job that would have to take place on a regular basis. So that in some cases makes it a little bit inconvenient in some farm situations. But there's many people there, I suppose, that are used to beet and they're set up for it. Ideally, it either needs to be fed with a diet feeder or else headspace for all. Because it's like giving chocolate to people or children, and they're all going to want their bit. And if someone gets the bowl of chocolate and finishes it all, and there's none left for the rest, well, then that's not so good. So with maize, maize then is a roughage feed, so it's a forage silage, and very good maize is very similar to high quality grass silage, and will give animal performance in a similar way. I suppose one positive is that if you and the trial work would bear this out, if you feed maize silage and grass silage together, you end up with a better performance than you would from than either of the two individual feeds. In other words, they complement one another. So that's a very positive aspect of feeding maize to high performing animals. Again, it's a low protein feed, a very good complement to grass silage, and also a really good complement to graze grass, particularly spring leafy grass that might have low dry matter. Maize with a high dry matter content generally tends to balance out very well in those diets. And that spring leafy grass can often have a high protein content, and so the maize being a low protein feed, obviously it takes advantage of that and fits very well with it. And feeding it out then on farm on a daily basis, look, it feeds like grass silage, so no extra equipment or time required to get the job done. And so then, okay, so where, what are the options, or how are these things being done? So I would expect that probably with the beet, probably less than half of it is being grown by people on their own farm, that the rest is being grown by arable farmers and is being contract grown essentially and delivered then on a regular basis. And that works really well. With maize, it might be 50-50 again, sort of half of it being grown by the farmer who's eventually going to use the crop, and half being grown on contract. And so in either case, or wherever it's been grown, the better the site, the better the performance in any given year, because both crops respond hugely to temperature and sunshine. And if you have a site that will allow a slightly higher temperature and a slightly higher exposure to sunshine during the summertime, well, there is payback for that. So, and in terms of like these two crops, as temperatures increase, as kind of average daily temperatures increase, like with grass growth, once you go above kind of a mean temperature of about 15 degrees, the growth performance increases almost in a straight line. But above that with grass, it doesn't increase that much more. Whereas maize and beet do. As the temperature and as the available sunshine keeps becoming, coming at a higher level, the two crops respond and yield more and more and more, providing they're not short of water. So to grow either, a good site is essential. Obviously, crop knowledge and access to the suitable machinery for sowing and harvesting. And obviously that could, in most cases, that's a suitable contractor in the area. And they both fit very well on an outside block of land or on rented land. And that's on a person's own farm. And then there's a lot of the crops that are being grown on contract. So the maize is delivered at harvest time to the pit, and the beet it's washed and delivered throughout the winter every week or every 2 weeks or whatever. And that system works really, really well. And to facilitate that, and I suppose have more firm arrangements there, Teagasc and Ciaran will mention it later, they have a grower and purchaser contract available on their website as the basis for a good, to come to a fair arrangement for both parties. And like for certain, the farmer growing the crop, he has to obviously cover all his costs. He has to get a payment towards the land, and he has to make a margin. And on the other hand, the person buying the crop wants the crop to be good value, wants it to stack up with the other crops that could be bought or could be traded. And so I would just mention something I often use is on the Teagasc website as well, there is a relative forage feed calculator, a relative feed calculator. And so if you Google Teagasc relative feed calculator, it'll bring you to the site. And that allows then, if you have a price for rolled barley and a price for soya or distillers grains, it'll punch out the values of a whole range of dry feeds and forage feeds that will give an idea of what's value for money. And so that's a very useful calculator that's available on the Teagasc website. So that's kind of, I suppose, the broad look at the options that are there. And so we'll now have a look in a bit more detail at the maize options. So yeah, I'm just covering on the area of the crop in the country. So in 2023, there was 19,300 hectares. And so that was up substantially from the year before. There was 24% of an increase. And so I suppose the two things that I would look at is the area that's been sown and the development of that over the years, and also the plastic usage. And that's an estimate based on what we think happened in the country. So back in 2010, there was 22,000 hectares of maize. And at that stage, half the crop was uncovered. And I suppose at that time, if you like, people had become a little too adventurous in the fields they picked for uncovered maize, and plus the fact that the varieties were not as good as they are now. And so with, I suppose, disappointing crops, people decided, look, we'll move on and we'll try something different. And so the acreage zone, it dropped down to 10,000 hectares in 2016. And at that stage, then plastic was probably being used on 90% of the crop and was doing a very good job. And that's why, look, that's why it was, it had developed into that sort of an area. Since then, okay, the varieties available for sowing uncovered have improved. And also then, as I say, in the last few years, the plastic has become more expensive. So last year, I would expect about 65% of the crop was under plastic. And this year, I expect that to drop a little further. But the area sown to plastic will probably be roughly the same, or maybe even slightly increased. It's just that the uncovered area, we expect it to increase. So with that, I want to bring in my colleague. Well, I'll just cover one last bit. So like the options again are, so it's in the open, so it's uncovered. And then the plastic option is compostable biodegradable plastic, costing, look, approximately €250 an acre, excluding VAT. And in reality, then you need about 1.25 tons of dry matter per acre to cover that extra cost. If you're just looking at a straight line as to, you know, getting payback for the investment. The other aspects of it, of that will come into consideration in using plastic would be, it may make a site that's completely unsuitable for uncovered maize suitable to grow a crop of maize. And so that's probably a lot of where it's used. You would like to have a crop with plastic being sown sometime in the next week or 10 days to get full advantage of what it offers. And look, it looks like that isn't going to be possible, because it's not really going to be possible. You can't see any significant sowings of maize for at least 2 or 3 weeks. And that's assuming that this high pressure that they're promising us actually does come. So just to go into the actual variety situation, and I'll call in my colleague Joe Millerick, and Joe can take you through this part of it.
Hi Dave. Hello. Yeah, so look, it's been there's no doubt it's been a difficult period, as Dave has mentioned, for every type of farming, dairy farming, tillage farming. So look, I know it myself. I'm working on a dairy farm with my father, so I understand that it's been a difficult period. Fodder is scarce. It's just been and the weather has just really went against trying to get cows out, trying to get grass in the diet. So look, we do feed a bit of beet at home. It's been a massive help now in this April, because we just haven't got cows out, and we're feeding silage, which is 2019 silage. So like, you know, having beet or maize at the moment for farmers who can't get out the grass is a huge benefit. And looking forward, like there's a huge gap to fill for all the silage that we fed in April, which we usually wouldn't feed. So like that'll have to be filled now, and like maize and beet will be options going forward for farmers to refill fodder stocks. And as one man described the fodder situation, like on farm, like you have to plan for the worst and hope for the best. Like we're after 4 months of rain, potentially could get a very dry period, which could affect silage, first cut silage, could affect grass growing in the summer, and then like we know how the autumns have been the last couple of years. So it's just definitely something I've seen on my own farm. We're delighted to have the beet, and I've been talking to farmers in Kilkenny and North Cork and Wexford the last couple of days who are feeding maize, and like they're delighted to have it because their cows are holding up well. And same with beef farmers who feed maize, like they're delighted to have it as well. Like they're keeping good forage into animals. Just to go through the maize in the open. So yeah, look, as Dave has mentioned, the good site is essential. Look, obviously south facing, warm and shelter is always a help. And less than 100 meters over sea level is definitely help. And like obviously when you're going in the open, you do have to go for the medium maturity varieties such as Ambition, Foxtrot and Saxon are very good options for this. You get a early harvest, and it's just the crop will get to maturity far earlier, so it's just a better option in the open to go with a variety such as that. Move on there, Dave.
Okay. Exactly.
Yeah, so in Goldcrop, we're extremely lucky to have a very strong portfolio of maize varieties in the open. Ambition doesn't need a major introduction. It's been tried and tested for the last 9 or 10 years. It's on the recommended list with 6 years. So like it's a super following out there. I believe Ambition is sold out in Goldcrop, and not even the 12th of April. It just shows the demand that has been there for it. Now we're lucky we have 2 new varieties coming from the same breeder, which also, along with ambition, have very, very medium maturity. They're quite early, and they've, as you can see, they're very good dry matter content, and they have very high starch. The fact that they're earlier varieties than other varieties on the recommended list. Saxon is on the recommended list. Foxtrot, which is probably our highest yielding variety, and it has a super following. The last year or two, it's been out. It will be on the recommended list in the next couple of years. It's done 2 years, so it just has to do another year to make it. But as regard those 3 varieties, there's a super following there for them. And look, the fact that they have good starch content, they have early, very high dry matter. Like if I was growing maize on my own farm, the two factors I really want are a good dry matter and a good starch content, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to benefit my animals, whether they be dairy cows or beef animals.
Yeah, so I just make a quick comment. And Joe said the ambition is sold out, and it's sold out because look, it's the variety that everybody knows, and there's definitely a much bigger interest in uncovered maize this year, and that's coming from the south and the east. It's coming from all the areas that have, there's loads of good sites through all that territory for growing maize. In all those river valleys. I live in the Blackwater Valley, and I mean the tide actually comes as far as Lismore, and we're like 20 miles inland. So obviously all the sites along the river from there to the coast are all at or below sea level, and there's loads of sites available in those river valleys all through Munster, and all up through the east coast. We've loads of Foxtrot and Saxon, and okay, we had plenty of ambition, but okay, we were probably bringing the others in instead to an extent because they are newer and better. And we were waiting, like until now, we've been waiting sort of 7 or 8 years to find a variety that could compete with ambition. So we're happy to have Foxtrot and Saxon to offer instead.
Yeah, and I do think the fact that, as you mentioned already, Dave, there won't be any maize sown looks for 2 or 3 weeks. Looking at the fork, look at the ground conditions, obviously, so an early variety in a late or potentially late sowing maize year will always be an advantage as well. Now you can see ambition and Saxon, how they stack up in the recommended list. So you see Saxon there, it's higher yielding than the ambition, so it's definitely a good option. And anyone who's used to ambition, there should be no issue moving on to Saxon or Foxtrot due to the maturity and from the same breed or very similar yield. And the ambitions Saxon and Foxtrot for the uncovered would be a safe option for a grower. There's other varieties on the recommended list that would be slightly later maturing than Saxon, ambition and Foxtrot. So especially the potentially late sown year, definitely if I'm growing a maize crop, I want to get it sown and I want to get it harvested before ground conditions get difficult. And potentially, if a summer is slightly not as hot as previous summers, I want to make sure I have a good cob. So that they're definitely the varieties I'd be going with.
Okay, I just throw in one comment there. Joe just reminded me. The weather, I suppose, the weather effects on crops of maize. And I remember reading a piece of research. It was looking at all the accumulated data, and it was Dard in Northern Ireland there. This is like 15 years ago, probably. They were looking at which months are important or the most important for a crop of maize. And okay, they had, really good data then to support the fact that the most important month by far was the month of June. That if you had a crop that was established properly, maybe in early May, that if it got a good month of June, it set it up for yield, and it allowed the plant, do all the stem extension and developing the embryonic cob and getting everything ready for producing yield, and that it set it up for high yield. And if we were ever waiting for a year to prove that, then it was last year, because we had a fantastic month of June. The crops just grew and grew and grew. And even though the weather from July and August and September was moderate, temperatures were only just okay, and okay, there was a lack of sunshine, the crops still yielded really, really well.
Yeah, I definitely concur with that. Even though harvest conditions were difficult for maize last year, growers were delighted with the yield and the quality. It turned out to be a very good year for people who grew it. Moving on to our varieties in the covered, I suppose our flagship offering would be LG 31207. It's probably the best maize variety covered option that we've ever had. I suppose a standout feature of the variety, as you can see in those in the photograph, is just the cobs and the stems are quite have a reddish colouring. But you can see the cobs are quite impressive. And like, look, there's been great following. A lot of merchants have taken on LG 31207 the last couple of years, and they have every year they come back for it. So like it has been a very successful variety. It's, I suppose, as regards the recommended list for maize varieties covered, the recommended list hasn't been done the last couple of years. So the department are trying to collaborate information on just a new biofilm, and there will be a recommended list coming for maize covered in the next couple of years. So you can just go on Goldcrop trial information and previous department plastic cover trial information. You can see there LG31 stacks up really well it's very high yield compared to Ambition under plastic. It's super high yield and very high, 8% higher starch content than the average of all the varieties. It's early medium maturity and it's quite tall, so like, it's very impressive in the field. Anyone who's grown it keeps coming back for it, so it's a very good sign of variety. And compared to other varieties that are available in the country, it's earlier harvest, like, and especially if you're going into potentially a late sowing for maize crops, it's definitely a safer bet in my opinion. And if you're growing maize yourself, you're going to have a higher dry matter yield and a higher starch contents. Like if I'm growing maize for myself, that's what I want. Ambition still has a following in the covered market due to if customers or contractors want early harvest, Ambition will definitely be the option to go with there. It's really early harvest, so it'll be less risk from that point of view. And another option maybe to do it is if a site was quite marginal, Ambition would be very, very good that way as well. Quite early harvest, and Ambition under plastic would be the safest bet. Have you any comment on LG, Dave?
Yeah, look, I suppose, the LG 31207, it has 3 years done in the department trials, but because of the change in plastic availability, they had trials, it was trialed in 2020 and 2021, but then because the old photodegradable film became illegal, and then the new film, they didn't sow a trial in 2022. So for that reason, there is trials for 2023, and there will be trials each year now, but they need 3 years of data with the new plastic before they can publish a list. But at the same time, the data is all valid, and the data that they have would give us great confidence in like these two varieties. But LG 31207 is by far the best variety we've ever had. And like Joe said, it's a little earlier than a lot of the mainstream varieties that are used in the market, so that will fit well in terms of it maybe taking advantage of a slightly shorter growing season. And it looks impressive. Again, the Ambition sold out. If someone's looking for something similar to Ambition to go under plastic, look, Saxon and Foxtrot, we have them in the recommended list trials. They both are exactly the same maturity as Ambition. We've had them in our own trials, so we expect them to do the same thing if the fact that Ambition is now sold out. So that covers the. Is there any other thing you want to say, Joe, or any other comments you want to make?
No, just look, I suppose it's definitely, I just encourage any growers or contractors or advisors just to be mindful to get their ducks in a row as regards ordering maize seed, ordering maize herbicide, or sorting out your ground plastic if required. So I just be encouraging growers, advisors, merchants just to get your ducks in a row, because last year it did get very tight towards the end of the season. There was a lot of kind of panic on people trying to source material. So that's the last thing I'd say. Just people just get organised now. If they need us, just go away and get stock.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.
So what I do is I'm just going to go through the similar situation on beet varieties and a chat on Conviso, and then some of the cereal crop options. So, okay, in terms of beet and the beet area that's grown in the country, it's been pretty consistent, bar one or two exceptions for the last 10 years. So it's been a kind of 9,500 to 10,000 hectares. In 2018, so the last time we had this kind of fodder scare in the springtime, the area did increase. It went up to 11,000 hectares, and I think look, it worked out really well at that time to try and help to put stocks in place for the following winter, which thankfully then wasn't a long winter, so it all worked out okay. But I'm anticipating, like, there was 9,500 hectares. If you like, the last 5 years have almost had the same area. I'm expecting a little bit of an increase this year, but because of the factors of, you know, the chopping that's required every day, and maybe the availability of machinery and harvesters and sowers, look, I think maize will probably be more popular as an option. But look, we've plenty beet anyway for whatever requirements are there. And just, I suppose, again, I want to talk about Conviso, and I suppose just to give a picture of what, you know, what type of beet has been grown in the market. So from 2020 onto 21, 22, 23, the Conviso beet, which we'll cover in a minute, it went from, in its year of introduction, it was 1% of the area, and now it's up to 8%. And it's been a pretty steady increase through the years, 1, 3, 5, 8, in terms of its development in the market. Sugar beet, normal sugar beet area, look, I put it at 12 in 2020, and it's dropped a little, but that's because some of the Conviso crops are taking from the sugar beet, because it's the Conviso that's available is actually sugar beet. And then the high dry matter fodder beets, that's consistent enough, and that's the likes of Enermax, so 72, 73, 72. And the one that's dropping a little is medium dry matter fodder beet. So we have Bolero in that market that's dropping a little, and then there is a regular 1% being grown for Jamon, which is purely a grazing variety. And so then, okay, there isn't, in terms of the varieties that we have available this year, it's all the same varieties we had available last year. And we have trials every year since 2006, and we look at, you know, new candidates in fodder beet, new candidates in sugar beet, and also candidates in the Conviso beet. And what we're always trying to do is find a better variety than the ones we're already offering in the market. And it's I suppose one of the things that's clear is that, you know, there's quite a few options. We get a good few options to try out for sugar beet, but the sugar beets that might do very well on the countries on the continent near us and in the UK, they may not always do so well here, because maybe our climate isn't quite as warm, it's a little bit wetter. So yeah, so we're always, you know, we'll only bring one to market if it's better than what's there. And so Alicia is our mainstream variety, and that's been in the market now for 4 or 5 years and is doing a very, very good job. And so it's the highest yield from a dry matter point of view of all the options available. And that's why, okay, if someone's grown for their own use, sugar beet's a really, really good option, or probably the best option. And if you look at, so it's 110 for relative dry matter yield, it's 95 for the relative fresh yield, and that being where Enermax is 100 for both of those things. So in other words, you'll have slightly fewer fresh tons with Alicia than Enermax, but you'll have a bit more dry matter. The other thing I suppose that stands out is we'd be always looking for good leaf on a plant. So some of these KWS sugar beets and Alicia is one, they're very upright leaves. They'll be very green and healthy kind of into October, November, but there isn't that big a bulk of them available. And then by January and February, it doesn't really start regrowing new leaves at that point, whereas things like Enermax and Bolero do. And so you will have more leaf probably in those fodder beet types if you're leaving it until January, February, March to actually harvest the crop. Lorena was the other sugar beet we've had last year, and that has, its selling point is that it's resistant to Rhizoctonia root rot, which is a problem on some farms, and mainly where there's maize in the rotation as well. But it has much better leaves than Alicia. I was hoping to offer more of it to the market this year, but there was a restriction on the amount of seed available, so I couldn't do that. But we do have seed of it still, and we have plenty of Alicia. In terms of the Conviso beets, and again, we've been trialing regularly, we're trialing varieties to see what's, you know, finding the most suitable varieties. And what we've had to date have all been sugar beet types. But the past year we had 2 fodder beet types, 2 varieties that are in the same bracket as Enermax. And one of those has worked out really, really well. Now it's still only a number, so it's not available for the market yet. But hopefully by next year it'll be registered and it'll be available. We can bring it to market. It was really fantastic from a yield point of view, right up there with Enermax and slightly higher in dry matter than Enermax, but you know, within a ton of Enermax and in terms of yield, and very good leaves. It had the best leaves in the field at harvest time. In terms of the 2 Conviso varieties we have for the market, we've Sanya and Janinka, and we've had those for two years, I'd say. Sanya certainly had better leaves in 2023, whereas Janinka had better leaves in 2022. But I think Sanya, being a slightly higher yielding one with slightly better leaves, is probably the slightly favoured one. But they're both very very similar performance. And the one thing I will say about KWS beets, so it's the Alicia, Larina, Janinka, Sanya, the establishment percentage in the field is always extremely high. So you could expect to establish 95% of the seeds that you sow. Whereas my expectation with the rest of the fodder beets will be more like 80%. And it's something to do with, it's the health of the seed that and the processes that it goes through. And again, all those seeds are primed. So they're kind of pre-germinated so that they establish very quickly. But we see it in the field all the time. And sometimes we get, the feedback that, look, the beet's a bit small. Well, it is because you sowed 40,000 seeds. The target to establish was 30, but you established 37 because the establishment rate was so high. And in that case, certainly look at spacing them out in the row a little bit more, and then you will have bigger roots. It won't affect the yields, but you'll have slightly bigger roots. By far, our biggest variety in Goldcrop is Enermax, and it's now the biggest variety in the market. So it's a high dry matter variety. It's white. It's super high yielding, and it has very good leaves. And we've had it in the market. We found it in our trials maybe 10 years ago, brought it to market, and it's doing a really good job out there. So I don't see that changing. It's probably 2/3 of the beet that we sell. Gusta is a good option, slightly higher dry matter yield, not quite as high in fresh yield. Will have a very high establishment rate because of its KWS parentage. And so that variety has a decent following in the market. And then we also have Magnum to offer to the market, which is a very similar variety to Enermax, just a little bit behind in yield. Bolero is our medium dry matter offering. We had Robus in the past, but Robus and Bolero, look, they're sister varieties. They're really similar. So a bit lower in dry matter yield, bit higher in fresh yield, the highest fresh yield of what we have to offer, really. It's a yellow variety, and again, look, it's been in the market for many years, so most people will be very familiar with it. And Jamon then is the one for grazing in the field. So then, just in terms of where do they fit? So if someone is grown for themselves and they're going to wash it, because I think sugar beets and Conviso beets and the high dry matter fodder beets, ideally they need to be washed because the soil content can be too high for good high performing animal diets. So in that case, then it's sugar beet, Conviso, or Enermax. They're the ones that will give the highest dry matter yield, and obviously it's been used at home. If it's for home use and it's definitely not going to be washed, well then I would suggest Bolero and harvested on when weather conditions are quite good, because you'd have a very low soil content then. If it's for the sale of white roots, the mainstream one would be Enermax and also Gusta. And when it's got to be white, look, there are situations out there that will require Conviso, so Conviso fits very well into that as well. For Alicia and Larina, you would say, look, you need to have a premium in the price. It's worth more from a feeding point of view because there's more dry matter in it. And so there should be a premium available. If it's available, yeah, grow Alicia or Larina to sell. But if the premium isn't available, it's Enermax. And then the last one, grazing in situ, Bolero is very suitable and Jamon's very suitable. So I suppose I just put up this slide because I like it as a picture, and it demonstrates to me, look, this is what you want in the month of June. You want, the weed spraying is all done, and you have a lovely clean field where you can see the rows up along, and the crop is growing quickly. And in a sunny day like this, like when this picture was taken, it'll make progress in closing the rows very quickly. So Ciaran is going to cover, some of the aspects on herbicide and weed control. The other thing on beet, I'm just going to give a quick run through, is the Conviso, which I mentioned already, but what it is really is it's a combination of specific varieties. So there are these smart varieties, Conviso smart varieties, and herbicide. And the herbicide comes from Bayer and the seeds come from KWS. And so the herbicide then is a mixture of 2 sulfonylureas, and these varieties are resistant to any effect from SUs. And that's a huge advantage because the 2 herbicides that are in here have a very broad weed spectrum. So they kill almost all the broadleaf weeds and almost all the grass weeds that could be inside in a field. A couple of exceptions, we'll cover them in a minute. But in terms of the concept then, or the package, you buy both. It's a 100,000 seed pack, which will do a hectare, and it's 1 litre of spray for a hectare. The package is going to work out probably to a similar cost as sugar beet seed plus a tree spray program. because it is a relatively, you know, it's an expensive enough package, but it delivers really well for what you pay for it. It's in terms of the way that the package is offered, most of the cost is in the seed price. So in actual fact, the herbicide is very cost effective, it's very cheap, but you're paying extra for the seed because that's where the payback in terms of the package was put. Now, in terms of the crop management, it's more flexible than a conventional situation. And as I said, it has really, really good weed control. And so the normal recommendation would be, you know, the Conviso 1 is the name of the herbicide. So at the 2-leaf stage of your main weeds, that's kind of the indicator, and you can see it here on the graphic. At the 2-leaf stage, 2 true leaf stage of the main weed, you go in with 0.5 litre per hectare. And then 10 plus days, 10 to 20 days after that, depending on the weather and everything else, you go in with the other 0.5 litre. And that will kill almost every possible weed that you would have in a field. There is another alternative to go with one spray and go 1 litre at the 4 true leaf stage of weeds in the field. The risk with that is that if you get bad weather at the time you're waiting, I suppose longer than you'd normally wait in a conventional program. And if you're waiting for the 4 true leaf stage and suddenly the weather disimproves and you can't get in there for a week or 10 days, you could have tricky situations. So that's why I favor the 2-spray program. You have more flexibility in terms of if the weather gets difficult. If you're waiting for the 2-leaf stage and, okay, if the weather is difficult, well, then a week later it's at the 4-leaf stage, just go in and do the 1 litre rate. So super weed control, very effective. And then just a couple of points on it, right? So the only kind of weeds that escape are, okay, speedwells are pretty poorly controlled. The SU resistant chickweed that's out there and SU resistant marigold that's out there, they won't be controlled well. And orage is only moderately controlled. Now the truth is most fields have some or all of them, particularly speedwells. Now while speedwells are not a very competitive weed with the crop, it's better to control them because they're taking up nutrients. They may compete with the small plants early on, and to control them, then look, the real strong program would be with that first spray, put in 0.6 of a litre of Oblix and a litre of Galtix, and that will certainly solve all problems. And that takes care of each of those speedwell, chickweed, orage, or marigold. So I would nearly say at this stage, plan on having to do that so that you don't end up with, you know, if you don't get in time with those sprays, with the Oblix and the Galtix, if it's, you know, if you're 3 weeks late, then you won't control those weeds. So try and plan to do it at the start. And if those weeds are not there, fine, no need to include it. And then just mentioning again that we have this Conviso fodder beet, which I'm really confident about. Fresh yield similar to Enermax, that I'm hoping that it'll be available commercially in the market next year. Okay. So then just a couple of the other things on Conviso. So where it's fit really well so far, or its real kind of niche in the market has been, if you have weed beet in a field, it's fantastic at controlling weed beet. So you can see in the picture here, the weed beet there in the uncontrolled plots, and you can see what it had to control. This wasn't just seedling weed beet, this was really well-established weed beet. And I would also say about the Conviso spray, it has a substantial or a long residual effect. So that when you go in, you know, similar to a 3-spray program in a conventional program. So when you spray and you finish your sprays at a very early stage of the crop, there's a good 8 or 10 weeks of residual effect that it'll kill anything else that comes through. So it's worked real miracles in terms of there's fields out there with a lot of weed beet seed that essentially were off the radar from the point of view of using for beet production in the last number of years, and it's allowed those fields to be used again. A very important trait is that the sprays, the Conviso seed or the crop is completely unaffected by the spray. So the picture here has a crop sprayed with Conviso and then an equivalent plant sprayed with classic herbicides. And look, you'll all know that if you're actually not hitting the beet to some extent in a normal conventional situation, well, you're probably not doing enough for the weeds either. So we're used to the crop being hammered or being hit to some extent. But in a Conviso situation, it won't be affected at all. So that's a plus. What we do need to do is avoid any possibility of weed beet seed having grown from Conviso crops being left in fields. So any bolters that may appear, And look, every crop has an opportunity that there's a risk of a certain amount of bolters. They really need to be taken care of so we don't end up with Conviso wild beet in future that we'll have no control of. And the other aspect of that then is any root that's left unharvested in a beet field has the opportunity to regrow in the following cereal crop or the following crop, whatever's in the field. And it's really important to kill those and not allow them to produce seed in that following year. And in the past, if you were in the year following a conventional crop of beet, any SU herbicide would have killed the conventional regrowing roots in the field. That won't work here. So obviously, Ally, Cameo, any of the usual SUs won't control this Conviso regrowing root. They call them groundkeepers. So what works best is the old chemistry. It's MCPA and 2,4-D. And I would say it needs to, a very early treatment probably won't do because those roots may not have shoved their leaves above ground by then. So it's probably maybe do your normal herbicide or a low rate of a normal herbicide at, when the crop is in the 2 or 3 leaf stage, and possibly then at growth stage 30 go in and treat specifically those groundkeepers if they're there. So that's the Conviso package, and I think, and Ciaran will mention it in the context of Debu becoming unavailable in the future. Conviso is going to be a much bigger part of the whole beet acreage that we're growing. 2 more slides for me, and it's just to kind of give 2 of the other options that are there, and it's just to give a summary really of where they fit and how they fit. So whole crop cereals, and so we did the costings earlier on looking at whole crop wheat, winter wheat and spring wheat, but any cereal is suitable. So it can be spring barley, it can be winter barley, hybrid rye, winter hybrid rye, triticale, any of them are suitable. And what you're always looking for, if you're the person who's going to feed that crop, you want a crop that had a high grain yield potential. So that if it was brought to harvest, it was going to have a high grain yield because you want that grain coming into your silage bit. The harvest date would be when the grain is at a hard cheese stage. The leaves and the stem still have some green. They're not gone into the strawy color completely. And then you're expecting your crop dry matter percentage to be at about 35%. And again, there's plenty of research and plenty of feed trials done in the past on whole crop cereals, and they feed really similar to maize silage. So you have a high dry matter feed. It ferments no problem because it's got a low buffering capacity. Maybe important not to allow it to get too dry, and that's why I'm saying when there's still some green in the leaves and stems, because if it gets too dry in the pit, if it's above sort of the 40% dry matter, you can have some secondary fermentation at the pit face as you're feeding it out. So again, feed performance similar to maize silage. Intakes are really good with it, really, really good, and animals are very content on it. So it's a really suitable option. And where that may fit this year for a livestock farmer is that he'll have a chat with his local arable farmer and say, look, you've sown that lovely crop of winter wheat last autumn. I'm interested in if it's a possibility of, harvesting that 3 weeks before your normal date, and we'll work out an amount and I can take whole crop silage out of it. So that's where that fits. At this stage to sow a winter cereal crop, the best bet's probably spring barley, and target a high yielding crop of spring barley. I mean, look, we've now become used to 3 ton plus crops of spring barley and on up to 4 tons even. I mean, something like that's going to make a really super whole crop cereal silage. And the other very, I suppose, suitable option this year is arable silage, and I'm calling arable silage where it's undersown with grass. And where it fits for me is normally grass is the most important thing from my point of view in the job that I do. And normally I would say to someone, look, sow the grass and don't give it something to have to compete with. Try and establish a really good sward of grass that you're going to use for 10 or 12 or 15 years. Then I'd prefer you didn't put something in there to compete with in that establishment phase. But where arable silage really fits is if you're going to be short of feed, it is then a very good option. So it's for something that's going to be reseeded anyway. And if you're tight on winter feed, sow a cereal or else cereal and peas. And so barley or oats are very, very suitable. Wheat is also suitable. Personally, I prefer to leave out the peas because they can cause a bit too much competition, particularly as the crop develops, and you can end up really hammering the crop of grass underneath. And I suppose in terms of making silage, if you're reseeding a field this year, that field will be in vegetative leaf growth all through this year. It will not produce any stem growth whatsoever. So a newly reseeded field is totally unsuitable for a crop of silage in year 1. And by adding a cereal that will grow a crop that gives it some fiber and some structure, then that allows you to make a very good crop of silage from this. And okay, drill the large seeds as normal, drill the cereal crop, and then broadcast the grass seeds, cover it and roll it. Cut at the soft cheese stage, so a bit earlier than we're saying with the whole crop cereal, and partly because you don't want to allow the cereal crop to be, have a full canopy over your grass sward for too long. And then the feed performance, it's really essentially similar to a grass silage. So that's my end of it. That's the slides, I suppose, that I wanted to go through. And look, we're open for any questions whatsoever. At this stage, now I'm going to go into the Q&A function. So as Ciaran is talking, I'll be checking on the questions that are there, and we'll be able to deal with them as required. So now I've stopped sharing, so I'm going to turn it over to Ciaran.
Thanks, Dave. I'm just going to share there. Hopefully you can see my slides there, yeah?
Yeah, I can see them, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, thanks. No, listen, thanks a million for the invitation, and I suppose I'm just conscious of time that is just after 12 there, so I won't delay too long. I suppose mainly what I'm going to go through was, or what Dave asked me was maybe not to go through the A to Z of agronomy, but maybe some of the things that are new and that are facing us this season, and a couple of maybe small reminders. I can skip over my first slide because Dave has that covered already. I suppose, like Dave, kind of just go back to 2018, and I suppose that gives us the best indication of where we might expect things to go this year. And I suppose we are expecting an increase this year in both maize and beet. So I'll start with maize. Just in terms of weed control, look, the basics, it needs 30 to 50 days weed free, and to avoid a penalty. And when Teagasc did trials, it's back a while ago, I remember them out in Knockbeg, there was 50% yield losses where there was poor weed control. So I think we're all familiar with that at this stage. And I suppose given, I'll come to it in a minute, maybe some were limited a little bit, especially for maize under plastic. Very important to control the perennial weeds before cultivation. So I suppose scotch, docks, thistles would be the ones there. So glyphosate there is the simple solution, and it really reduces the overall weed burden on that one. I suppose then in terms of some of the changes, maybe label changes, certainly with Calaris or CropLink Maize Clean that people would be familiar with, its use now is for use in the open only. The rate is 1.5 litres, and it's just one treatment per crop, okay, and between growth stage 12 and 18 there. So the other one there is no more than one application once in every 3 years in the same field, okay, just to keep that one in mind as well. So it certainly is a loss for crops grown under plastic. Now for crops in the open, there's a really good alternative in Luminous there. People will be familiar with Ascent there for grass weed control and good on brassicas as well. So that's the partner there. At 1.5 litres, it's a really good alternative, and lots of people used it last year instead of Calaris or Maize Clean and got on really well with it. It does have a really broad spectrum there, so that's a really good alternative. Just in terms of crops under plastic, we are limited, as I said, without Calaris, so it's essentially pendimethalin based products. Obviously you're doing a pre-M. The likes of Most Micro, Stomp Aqua, Anthem there, you can just see the rates there. They're delivering about 1,500 grams per hectare there of pendimethalin. Generally will do a good job. The likes of Wing P or Clayton Launch, certainly it will offer some extra activity on some key weeds there, the likes of maybe groundsel, which would be pendimethalin, would be weak on meadowgrass and orage there as well. So if you want to add a little bit of persistency there, you can top up the pendimethalin there with one of those straight products. So look, that's the pre-emergence. It's quite straightforward at this stage without when you take Calaris off the field. But as Dave said, look, most of the majority, I think 55% is the estimate there, of crops will be grown in the open. So again, look, you obviously have the Calaris there and the maize clean, which we've discussed already. The Luminous there is, as I said, is a really, really good option. So I think for most people, they will be the two options. You still do have the pre-em option if you want to go down that road in crops in the open, which are pendimethalin. And then you have, I suppose, the few bits for tidy up, really. I suppose the likes of Floxpower products, for the likes of docks, if you have that, which can be difficult to control at times. Volunteer potatoes. The Ascentas I mentioned earlier on is really good to control, especially for tillage farmers. Maybe who have wild oats, or maybe the likes of volunteer oilseed rape can slip through some of those post-emergent options as well. So look, they're there, and then the likes of Pasture Trios is quite broad spectrum there as well. So look, very good options there for post-emergence. Just on the fertilizer, I won't go through all the ins and outs of it, but I just put the tables up there in terms of where indices are and what you would require. But I suppose that what I really wanted to do here is just to remind people that if you have no soil test report, you have no P allowance. You can't grow maize without phosphorus. So you just make sure just that everybody, that you have enough soil tests on your farm, one test per 5 hectares, to make sure that you have a P allowance. Because even at index 4, which for a cereal crop you'd have no P allowance, there is a 20 kilo allowance there for maize. And I suppose the other point there is just in relation to slurry. I mean, cattle slurry can make a significant difference to the costs. And, we'll talk about forage contracts in a minute, but like if there is, the livestock farmer can provide maybe slurry to a tillage farmer, and it can reduce the costs that can be factored into any forage contracts that are there. So look, the dry matter really is the crucial piece here. Like the figures I have here, I would, in old money, like Dave said at the start, I'm that way as well. Look, 1,000 gallons of cattle slurry, 9,532, but that's at 6% dry matter, so just to be careful and keep an eye on the dry matter. And, I suppose pig slurry would be the one where we often, maybe if you're using that, can, the dry matter can be quite variable, but you can just see, look, where you're down to 4% dry matter in cattle slurry, the reduction there, you're going from 9 units, maybe equivalent to 6. So just be careful on the dry matter, and don't just allow for it, I suppose, really. And just on the beet, I've maybe Dave's picture earlier on, it could be from the same field, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. So it's something that we all wish for, a nice clean full crop of beet meeting the rows. And I suppose to get that, we need really good weed control, and Debut has been the cornerstone of weed control. I was trying to remember this morning, I think it's someone will correct me now, 97 or 98 I think Debut came on the market. I'm old enough just about to remember the pre-Debut days, and the likes of Brassicas, Charlock were really, really difficult to control. We saw a lot more steerage going into row cultivation back in those days because of the difficulties that we had. And to be fair to Debut, it's been a massive servant to weed control in beet in that time. However, its time is up. Debut, Safari, Light, Shiro, they're all the same. The last sale for distributors is the 20th of May. And the last date of use, which isn't a problem obviously for this season, is the 20th of August. So, I mean, we will have to adjust life after Debut. As I said, we will have to change our regimes. Dave mentioned the Conviso, and that's the obvious one where you have issues with brassica weeds, I suppose, really for most people. Certainly back in the pre-Debut days, we probably had a little bit more pre-em going on. We're going to have a little bit more maybe low dose and maybe an additional application if for some fields that maybe particularly the likes of brassicas, as I mentioned, really. But anyway, for this season, Debut is we can use it up to the 20th of August. So something we have to think about for next year. I won't go through the Conviso. All I have here is exactly backing up what Dave said. The only comment I'm going to make on it is when Conviso came out first, and the one thing that really struck struck me, apart from the weed control, was the crop effect. And that was one thing that I suppose sometimes we don't allow for in terms of the overall yield, that when we do get a good job on weed control, we often set back the crop. And, you know, those delays in May and June certainly cost yield. There is a yield penalty there that you don't have with Conviso. So again, the beet, again, look, the soil test, just a reminder there. And the other one that just seeing a little bit more of is boron. Boron's very water soluble, shows up particularly on light soils. So imagine the rain that we've had since last July. So again, just don't forget boron. It doesn't often come in the fertilizer that you'll be using for beet nowadays. So just to make sure to get something like solid boron, maybe 2-3 applications during the year, depending on your soil test report. And it's worth including boron in the soil test report, really, if you're getting a specific test done for a field of beet. And just I'm kind of nearly there. Just one mention on disease control. We're a long ways away from it, and Dave mentioned the quality of leaves after Scopastra was a big issue last year. Something that I hadn't seen for a long time. I suppose probably a lot to do with the weather conditions, particularly in July when it was very mild and wet, and they were the ideal conditions. So I suppose, look, just to emphasize, you know, to get that there are options. They're limited. Difenoconazole is the main active there with Amistar in Angle. You know, it does work 2 applications if you're harvesting late, and the same with the straight product there. We did, and I think I remember mentioning to Dave maybe last August, where there was a field where there was a tram line or a skip with the sprayer, and the difference in disease control was phenomenal. So, you know, it is something, especially if you've late harvested beet, just to remember. And my last slide is just a reminder on buffer zones. Just that a 6-meter buffer, so a 3-meter buffer zone next to water, not hedges now, just next to water, a 3-meter buffer zone applies to all crops. But a 6-meter buffer zone is applicable where you've late harvested crops. So they're crops harvested after 15th of September. So maize and beet come in there. Now, the important thing there is it's only what they call the intersecting water course. So that's where the flow of water. So I don't know how clear my diagram is, but if you look at it, I've water on 3 sides of my little imaginary field there. So you've a 3-meter buffer on the left and right, but you've got a 6-meter buffer on the bottom, because that's the field slope, or the intersecting water course, is the direction that the water would go. So, you know, it's uncultivated, you know, you just let it there. So what some people have suggested to me, and it's not a bad idea, is leave your 3 meters as you always would, and maybe plant a headland of cereal, because you will have that gone before the 15th of September, well, hopefully, and, you know, maybe make a headland there, and I suppose that maybe reduces the effect of the buffer somewhat. So, Dave, they're my slides. Oh, sorry, my last slide, which is nearly my most important in some ways. There are lots of growers who have very, very good arrangements. You know, tillage farmers growing for livestock farmers, arrangements going on with years, working really well, and that's fine. I suppose the forage contract really is for maybe newer growers, and it gives people a chance to maybe outline what you're looking for. You can have as little or as much information in it as required, but it is good security for both sides, really, because, you know, it gives the livestock farmer an assurance that, you know, whatever agreement is there, whatever product, beet or maize or whatever it is, whole crop will be delivered. And I suppose then on the other side, obviously there's a massive cost in growing these crops, and it gives the tillage farmer assurance that, you know, that there's a commitment there to purchase the crop. And I suppose really it does come around to the money side of it. What works for me is maybe stage payments, where you might maybe have a third of it up front, say when the crop is being sown, maybe a third mid-season, and a final third there, you know, when the crop is delivered at the end of the year. And as I said, there can be as much or as little data information in that as required. Like, some people will go down to specifying varieties, dry matters. Ideally, it wouldn't be tons. We'd be supplying tons of dry matter, and, you know, some people go down that road, and that's great if you can do that. So look, just the forage contract, my last one there, just as a kind of a reminder for people that tis hugely important. Sorry, I got off it there now, but I'll stop sharing there, Dave, if I can
Okay.
get this up. Stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. Very comprehensive as always, and covered all the kind of the main points. And as I said earlier on, look, we haven't gone through every single thing in absolute detail, because most people that are on, they're familiar with lots of the information that's required. But I would say that if anyone needs anything extra, make contact with us in Goldcrop or make contact with Ciaran, and we can help anyone out that needs any extra information. I have one question that's come up, and it's one that I'm not 100% sure of the answer, so I'll call out the question. The new nitrate figure for a dairy cow is dependent on the crude protein of the concentrate feed to a dairy cow. And so that's obviously part of the package that everyone's having to get used to now. And then feeding maize or beet or whole crop, because they're all low protein feeds, will require a 25 to 30% crude protein concentrate while indoors with no grass. And will this affect farmer uptake and the use of maize and beet going forward? And the answer is I don't know, because I haven't had anyone raise it with me or mention it. And personally, I'm not exactly sure what the consequences would be. So if someone hadn't grown maize before and decided to grow, for 100 cow herd, decided to grow 20 acres of maize, what impact is that exactly going to have on his stocking rate, what stocking rate he's allowed? I would say, as I say, I haven't seen any impact of it to date. For sure, they are all lower protein feedstuffs. Very high quality energy in all of them, very good intake possibilities with all of them, but not that high in protein. I suppose if I think of what's a solution, maybe would be to have, part of your silage coming from red clover silage that will have a slightly higher protein content. You're probably hoping for maybe 2% extra protein in red clover silage in comparison to normal grass silage, and use that as a way of helping to balance those lower protein feedstuffs. That's about as comprehensive an answer as I can give. I don't see any other questions there. So, look, I'm hugely thankful to everyone for joining us this morning. And what we have really is a mixture of farmers and lots of, I suppose, agronomists and tradespeople and people in the industry. And it's a great blend of, I suppose, the people that are waiting to get into action and get jobs done around the place. It has been, look, it's the most challenging season I've seen. And I suppose from a Goldcrop perspective, seed is our game. So like all the cereal seed that we've put out or been working hard on putting it into bags for the last 4 months, most of that is still in those bags. And that's a really difficult situation for the industry. You'd have to say that to be in the game, whether it's a livestock farmer, a dairy farmer, beef, or an arable farmer, you have to be an optimist. And I'd also say that for the people in the trade, right around the country, from ourselves to all our retail customers, our retailer customers, we're all optimists, because otherwise, when we've had these difficult years in the past, you might just throw in the towel. But we all keep going back, and I start out every January absolutely hugely optimistic for what's going to happen within my part of the game for the year. And okay, it gets chipped away at maybe in the first few months, but usually things balance out some way fair. So that's what we're hoping for. It's been very challenging so far. I'd like to wish everybody the best of luck for the year. Hope everything works out. We're there if you need to call us. Again, I just thank Ciaran for his help this morning and his regular help, because when I have a question I don't know the answer to, he's often the guy I'll ring. And also Joe Millerick, as I say, he covers the south and the southeast for us, and is I suppose is doing a great job from that point of view. And again, and when he was talking himself, he's from a farmer background, and a lot of the challenges that might be out there in the industry, they're dealing with him at home, so he's got it firsthand. So with that, I'd say thank you to all. Thanks for joining us this morning, and keep in touch.